Hello there, this is Irina, historian and history teacher with a research interest in Viking studies and Old Norse. Today, a couple of bits of information about two things: how much we have left from Icelandic medieval sources and who wrote it all. So, like I mentioned before in previous videos, the writing culture in Iceland seems to have been glorious for such a rural society with basically no towns and somewhat at the edge of the inhabitable universe, at least at the time. Under the circumstances, a remarkable number of manuscripts seems to have been produced in the Middle Ages. It is, on the other hand, very hard to say how many were produced and how many still exist. This also depends on how you define the Middle Ages and manuscript. So let's say that when we're talking about Icelandic manuscripts, we usually mean books above all else, so codices, not including diplomas or charters. And in terms of defining the Middle Ages, in the context of Iceland, at least, the Middle Ages seem to have ceased in the middle of the 16th century. There are several reasons for that. First of all, we have the linguistic grounds, some changes in the language, and then we have the Protestant Reformation, which was complete in 1550 in Iceland. So we can say that some things happened in the 16th century that lead us to believe that from this point on, we rather talk about a modern or at least pre-modern society rather than the Middle Ages. It is also to take into account that the printing press arrives in Iceland in 1530. In the same time, we have the arrival of paper, which replaced the previously used vellum or calfskin, which is what manuscripts were written on, which means that it was easier to get hold of cheaper material and the number of manuscripts produced increased. So the Middle Ages in Iceland, to sum it up, between the 12th and the 16th century. In this period, it is estimated that we have around 750 Icelandic manuscripts written in the vernacular, so in Old Icelandic or Old West Norse, as it is also called, rather than in Latin. We don't really know exactly how many, for the reason that a lot of these manuscripts are fragmentary. In fact, just over 50% of them are 5 leaves or fewer out of a book that must have been much larger than that. And when you have so many fragments, it is not always that obvious which 2 fragments came from the same original source. So it is an estimation, vaguely 750. Now, was that a big proportion or a small proportion? Well, internal evidence from Iceland and also in comparison to other countries suggests that this means roughly between 15 and 20%. Sure, you can say a very large number of manuscripts survived, but when you think about this very small percent, it makes you appreciate even more those which are left. This is still a very large amount of stuff being produced in a rather small and isolated community. Why was that so? I tried explaining this in another video, but it is still baffling for most people studying the period and its literature. Icelanders were world famous in the Middle Ages as well for their manuscripts. So let's remember the fact that we have a lot of them, but a lot of them were also lost. What were the main causes of this destruction? Well, first of all, the Reformation, which led to the reusal of a lot of Catholic manuscripts. And then we have the problem with the vellum, which is quite a useful substance. You can do a lot of things with it. The vellum was also repurposed. It was being cut and then reused in book binding, for example. So some of these fragments continue to reappear as book bindings on older manuscripts. They're pretty broken and defective, so we have bits spread out everywhere. That's another major cause of them being destroyed. Well, then we also have the way people referred and handled these manuscripts. They usually read them with dirty hands, which also led to them being washed up pretty much. And people in the, let's say, 15th, 16th century started to show a lesser interest in them. They would have been probably more difficult to read. I mean, the manuscripts from 13th and 14th century. Not necessarily for linguistic reasons, because the morphology and grammar of Icelandic is more or less the same. Even today, it is not that difficult to read stuff in Old Norse if you know modern Icelandic. Then again, you have pronunciation, which has changed, but that doesn't really show up in writing. We rather refer to changes in the handwriting and some changes in the vocabulary. So some stuff was just beginning to be more difficult to read. So the older manuscripts, and they started recopying them less and less, and just limit themselves to those which were easier to read. So basically, that material was culturally used up, if you will. Now, a little bit about who wrote them. Well, it is safe to say that most works of literature in Iceland are anonymous, so they cannot be attributed to named authors. Of course, we're not referring to Snorri and his poetics manual, the Snorra Edda, the Prose Edda, but to the stories. Then there is also the question about the scribes. All right, so the authors were anonymous, but were the scribes also anonymous? Well, plainly speaking, yes. In the post-medieval period, they start writing their names on the manuscript, but in the Middle Ages, it is quite unusual for them to do so. It was just not considered as important as nowadays to know who wrote it. It is also hard to tell when a scribe himself became an author, because no one ever copied exactly what was in front of them. Something was always being changed. Some changes were small and accidental, like you could leave out a word or a full sentence. Some of the changes were deliberate, and scribes, in this sense, kind of modernized the language. They would write, for example, a word themselves as they would write it, not as it was in the original manuscript. Sometimes they would add things or leave things out. Yeah, this could have a couple of reasons. They just thought it sounded better, or maybe they were also running out of room. So, like, they had four leaves and they had to copy 5 leaves. Or on the other hand, when they saw that they had a little bit of extra room, why not add something of your own describing something they considered significant? So all kinds of reasons for things being changed, which leads to another important question: what was a copy and what was the original version? And when does a text begin to be considered an original version rather than a copy of a text of a saga? With all the Icelandic sagas, we have more than one version. So Njol saga, for example, has dozens of versions. The sagas of the ancient times, the Fornaldrasögur, also have 2 versions, at least 2 versions each. One longer and younger, and another one older and shorter. This doesn't mean that, aesthetically speaking, the older one should be regarded as superior. Sometimes it is quite the opposite. So there are very different ways to look at this problem. And to sum it up, we can say that scribes, editors, authors, they are all part of this never-ending process of writing. All scribes change things, some of them more than others, and you could say that some of them were actually the authors of this book. They probably did not think of themselves as being authors, but from a contemporary perspective, you might say so. So as you can see, pretty difficult to interpret all this. Nevertheless, I hoped I could answer some of your questions, and if you enjoyed listening to me, I kindly invite you to subscribe and maybe also to check out my TikTok. All the best to you. Till next time.